social media, the way that information is distributed. People don't have the attention span, outward energies and inward energies. Like when people sort of understand it, they either really get it or not. And I think that's fine. Like not everyone has to be comfortable with this sort of way of being. And they're all a holistic approach to wellness and life. So the body is connected to the spirit, to the soul, and is connected to the things that you do and the output that you
Lili, welcome to the Arteffects podcast. I'm so excited to have you on. I've been waiting for this conversation for a really long time. Welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, and it's so good to see you. I'm really looking forward to our chat today.
Yeah, me too. So first, before we dive into the questions, I just wanted to ask you, who would you like to dedicate today's episode to?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would like to dedicate this episode to an artist named Bernice Bing, who has always been a big inspiration of mine. Bernice Bing is an activist from a long time ago. She's passed, she's no longer with us, and also a painter, LGBTQI activist, and someone who I really look up to as far as the work goes.
That's beautiful. No one else has ever dedicated episodes to someone who has passed before, so that really means a lot to me. So thank you for that. We studied together at the China Academy of Art and was there in 2019 when COVID broke out and just sort of had to navigate life thereafter. And it was a really interesting moment in history, but also I feel like personally as well. I feel like the world was really at that moment in time, taking a step back to sort of look inward. And so I'm wondering how that moment in time affected you, your work, has sort of led you on the path that you have taken since then.
Yeah, it's a great question. I really think semester at CAA left a deep, profound impact on me. And I think the process of me deciding to do this study in China was also a very big decision. Being someone who is from the Chinese diaspora, I grew up in Tennessee in the US and also in bits in Wuhan in China, where my family is from. So I'm very familiar with everything that happened in Wuhan. I had a very strange relationship with my heritage for most of my life. And I think it's very common for people who are from a diasporic background to have these questions of identity, belonging, etc. At the time when I decided to go to China, I had been living in Berlin for a while, and Berlin was a place that gave me a bit of distance from these questions of identity and the opportunity to sort of rebuild myself, reinvent myself in a way that I thought was most appropriate and experiment a bit, break out of certain habits. And then the semester in China, along with the ensuing COVID time, really brought me to this deep inner state of reflection. And also in China, I discovered meditation, Daoism, these traditional techniques of shui painting and guohua that we were exposed to at the academy. All of this gave me a new appreciation for the tradition that comes from China. And since then, my work has just radically changed. I mean, prior to this time, I was making a much more figurative work and it's just more realistic style of painting. And then since then, it's become very much more abstract, more spiritual, based in ritual, based in these sort of ancestral practices as well.
I love that. I remember you presenting on a particular body of work that deeply resonated with me. This was, I think, probably 2020. I remember you presented about a work where you did a meditation for over 30 days, because I remember you were talking about that work and just sort of how every day was a meditative moment for you, reflecting on this topic. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about just how meditation has sort of grounded you and allowed you to possibly make work that is present and felt and embodied based on your interactions with it.
That project you're speaking about specifically was in relation to the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement and also the murder of George Floyd. And that was my way of processing these emotions and seeing everything happening in the news along with this very fresh kind of pandemic moment. A lot of frustration and inner rage, I guess, as well as sadness and confusion being channeled into a meditative state. And the meditation was really, it began as just a way of dealing with the situation. And then it turned into more a very useful tool of reflection that felt more productive in a way than just being on Instagram, reposting these squares of information and then
Right.
like feeding into this loop of sadness and despair. From that point forward, I think, and also as I mentioned previously, things we learned at the China Academy of Art and in general about the Chinese philosophy of painting is that the object of art making is not necessarily to represent something accurately, but more so to reflect the inner spirit or the essence of the thing that you're trying to do or the object you're trying to reproduce. And it's also about like the feeling you have as the person like making this work. This is not only unique to Chinese tradition, but I think this is the central core like value of the philosophy. This goes quite hand in hand with a more process-based approach to art making. And when I say process-based, I just mean that, again, it's not about the actual thing that's made at the end, but just the steps you took to get there. So for me, this takes the form of like little daily interventions or little daily moments where I'm sitting down and just making that space to create. Or that has been a very useful way of producing for me, where I'm trying to maybe take the pressure out of producing this big monumental thing. And then it just happens over the course of time. So if I can just pull out like 10 minutes of my day to do something, doing it consistently over a period of time also results in something it over time becomes monumental. And this can be done in a way that's based on producing. So for example, drawings or making objects, practicing a skill, or it can be done in a more sort of on a spiritual level where you're also taking this time out of your life daily, if possible, to just check in and connect with that inner space. So this, I think, is the core of where my work sits. And I hope that it stays like that, because for me, I'm interested in things that endure and things that are sustainable. So this feels like a good place for the practices.
I would also say that my work has also sort of shifted thinking about sort of like the intersection of like art and wellness as well, and how maybe our inner world and our inner life impacts literally like everything around us. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how your art has sort of acted as like a healing tool for you in your life. And as you're navigating, life is happening, we're navigating through, but being an artist, I feel like we have a really unique position in the world to transmute or translate some of those emotions. And so I'm wondering, how do you use art as a healing modality in your life and in your practice?
Yeah, it kind of permeates through everything I do. At this moment, and I think it'll continue to be this way, I do have two-sided relationship to this. There's the internal side where I do think that's just for me. The aim is not to necessarily share it, but again, it's more about this process and the feeling I have while doing it. And that's just like an internal grounding. If it ends up being that I create something in that process that looks great, it works. And I'm kind of trained enough at this point visually to know like what would look good. Or if there's like a residency or a project or an exhibition I have to prepare something for, then there's always that framework. But just again, this practice, this sort of promise to myself that I will make space for this in my life, because it is what I'm passionate about. I mean, this what is one aspect of it. And then the other aspect is the social practice. I'm pretty active in terms of being engaged with the education space, as well as being involved in many different communities. And in those spaces, I always see art as a tool for bringing people together, helping people who maybe feel they don't have access to a certain thing, find an entry point into an issue, or just a way for a community to heal itself and have a space for reflection. There's like the internal face inside, and then the way of bringing this to an external space with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how your connection with like communities through possibly performance. Like, I'm not sure if you're still doing performance in your practice. I know that was something that you were deeply steeped in the past. And so I would love to hear if you're still doing performance, and also if you could speak a little bit about your collective that you are a part of as well.
Sure. Yeah. Again, there's like these two sides. So I do solo work sometimes, and then the solo work is still rooted in the traditions of my heritage and almost seeing like the audience as a medium to work with, right? Like, and the time and the space and the location as a medium to work with. Performance is so fascinating because it feels like the most abstract in a way out of all these different art forms. Like it could be anything, right? Like you've heard people say like, my life is a performance. I mean, why not? I really like that mentality. It offers a lot of potential. I was working on a piece called Thunder in the Middle of the Lake, which is long story short, it's based off of a traditional sort of explanation of why there is lightning before thunder. And this is a myth. And then I was sort of taking this and embodying it in a performance as my own practice. And then through that, just examining these traditions and maybe the parts of tradition that I don't necessarily agree with, or the nuances of tradition that where there's places you want to keep or places you want to poke at and question. The performance I see as a very effective tool for addressing those issues. And then with the collective, so I'm part of this collective called Mengtong Collective, and we are a group of artists we live in different places now, but the work we've been doing is really about communal healing, archive making, creating a space for Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in the South of the US specifically to process their experiences, assimilating in the region. I think we've seen that there's a strong need to talk about this in the area because the conversation is mostly heavily focused in the west side of the US, California and or New York City, or eastern region where there's bigger populations. Most people don't realize that there are pockets of immigrant communities in the South. And it has a very different dynamic because the South anyways is a space with a very tense history with race. So the group has come together and we also use performance as an aspect of our practice. For example, we've done a performance where we were using ink to paint on each other and kind of like a telephone game. And then the person was supposed to transcribe the image that was being painted on their back to the person in the front. And this was a way of embodying this unspoken generational knowledge, how information and touch can be passed along without words. So that was a performance we did in the group setting that was very visually powerful as well as conceptually strong.
Oh, that's amazing. And you guys also have an exhibition coming up soon in the future?
Yes. So in 2026, next year in February, we have a show at She Cake Gallery, and we will show because some of these performances resulted in these ink paintings that we were sitting on top of. So it was like the drips that came down and or marks that we made live. So there's 2 pieces that were created from those performances. We'll show those, and then each person in the group has also their own work that will be shown. And I think we're going to try to devise another performance before then.
Oh, that's amazing. And wishing you guys all the best with that. I think it's really beautiful that you have come together as a collective, sharing information and ideas about your culture, about your heritage, accessing the archive. And in a way, I would also argue and say that you're also creating a new living archive as well. The fact that you've come together and you're making work together. I'm curious about your ideas about the tension between your chosen and inherited identity, because it's interesting. Your identity is multi-layered. You know, you're of Chinese heritage, raised in the south of the US and now living in Berlin. And so there are so many different moments throughout your life that sort of like make up who you are. And so I'm curious if you could speak about like what part of your identity like feels most fluid or sort of most rooted right now at this moment.
That's a great question. And that is stated in my bio. I think at the time when I wrote that, I kept it in my bio for a while because I do like to make this distinction, right? In the beginning of my time when I left the US, and that was when I was struggling the most with my identity and my feelings of belonging, that phrase chosen versus inherited identity was referring more to the fact that I hated being Chinese for a big part of my life, as a young person, because it was the reason it was what singled me out as different from my environment. And also in the context of being in Wuhan in China, I actually went to school in Wuhan some summers, like it was during when the US had the school breaks, and then I would be in China and then the school was still ongoing. So I didn't get my summer break. I was in school and I was visiting family there. So even there, I was also very obviously not from there, just because of my mannerisms, the way I behave and my accent. So this was a very prominent feeling of this inherited identity where it's like the place where I was born into, the circumstances I was born into, the sort of generational circumstances in my family was manifested in me in ways that I didn't feel like I understood yet when I was younger. And I felt very resentful of it. And I felt very victimized in a way because of these differences. Or is that the right word, victimized? Well, basically, like, there was prejudice placed upon me because of these noticeable behaviors. And I'm also from a rather traditional family. So my parents raised me speaking Mandarin. So there's also parts of growing up in the US where people, like, I didn't know things. I didn't really watch TV in the US that was like American TV. We were always watching like Chinese soap operas at home and eating Chinese food. Like, it was very like a bubble. You know, going then later to Berlin was my choosing the identity. And then at that time, it was also very exploratory phase where it was like, oh, you can actually decide on who you consider family or who you consider to be your influences. You know, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I dedicate this to Bernice Bing, and Bernice Bing is kind of like a chosen ancestor. The picture of Bernice sits on my altar, actually, because I always imagine myself as being connected to this person and the spirit they embody. So I think that for me was a way of finding agency in the world. Now, actually, where I am now, I think I've almost circled back to this, let's say, inherited identity, which is of being Chinese. And I've found myself with a very deep appreciation for the traditions of the culture. Whereas before, I only understood it on a very surface level. So for me, it was something that looked kitschy or felt like a joke or felt very superficial in a way because of also the way I consumed media before really understanding the depth of this culture. Like, it was just these sort of kung fu characters, or it was like a very filtered down version of Chinese culture, like, oh, yin yang symbol, like on a streetwear merch, or, you know, the dragon labels and designs on things. It feels a bit kitschy, right? But then once you understand that there's a very deep and very enduring worldview and philosophy around these symbols, it becomes a lot more powerful. And I think that feels more aligned with where I see myself right now, and the things I believe in are actually more aligned with, I guess, the inherited identity that I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I'm just also thinking about our time in China and how deeply transformational, even though it was a short time there in Hangzhou, I transformed drastically, like, as a person. And it's so interesting because you're of Chinese heritage, but like for me, being Bermudian and then living in China was obviously like a very different experience. But it's interesting how you say that when you were there, like you felt like you came into understanding like more about yourself in that moment. And I would say like the same thing for me too. I feel like I became more Bermudian once I was in China. Like, it almost like it put a mirror in front of me to ask myself, like, you know, like, who are you and like what's your position in this world and what is it that you want to say? And I just think it's just so fascinating how travel, or how like going to a different place, really has that ability for you to take what you will along the way. And I just really appreciate you sharing about that. And so I'm wondering, based upon the work that you're making, if there are any moments in your practice where you're thinking about historical fiction in your work, or like using things that very much so are like rooted in Chinese tradition and heritage and culture, and maybe like sort of rewriting them in some way, shape, or form. I'm curious if that is one of the things that you are doing in your practice.
I think it's happening on a subconscious level for sure. As I was saying, most of the work I'm doing right now is rather abstract and dealing more with like creating an environment. And it's a little hard to point to exact, let's say, narratives. But the performance piece I mentioned earlier, it's Thunder in the Middle of the Lake, is based on the story of this goddess Dianmu and the god Lego. There is also a reinvention. The performance is a reinvention of that story. And I'm questioning the sort of gender dynamics there. So a lot of the work I do now is also very influenced by a Taiji Chuan practice that I've started and been really deep diving into under my mentor, Abby. There's also a lot of reading on I Ching text and Taoist text that I'm doing. And I think these texts would count certainly as like historical narratives. I mean, they're really old and they come from, I guess they emerge basically as an oral tradition or emerged as a sort of philosophy. There are certain people credited to writing the original text, but and sort of copying down everything initially, but this is thousands of years ago. It's really hard to know. And it's also, since then, there's been like so many people creating different interpretations of these texts. So the work I do is very influenced by it. So I do see the images I'm creating as an attempt to visually translate these texts, the philosophies that are held within and the knowledge that are held within the writing. I think my visual understanding of it is influenced by these different places that I lived in. And I guess it is a unique language to me.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. It has me like the fact that you're like studying Taoism now, I think is fantastic.
It
And
makes
I'm really
sense, right?
excited. I know that is like so cool. And I'm just really excited to see like where the work is going to go, you know, based upon like all of these teachings and learnings that you have been engaged in. I mean, I feel like when we tap into sort of like spiritual or philosophical things, I think that that like truly like impacts the work. And I'm thrilled to see like where that's gonna go, especially considering your work already has this meditative and ritualistic feel. That's quite exciting. I wanted to, I guess, like expand upon that, like, right? Because you have your meditative practice that you said, you know, you developed in China, which, you know, similarly to me, I also developed like a meditative practice and a yoga practice in China as well. And so I'm wondering, like, you have the meditative practice, you're, you know, studying Taoism. I'm wondering if you view those things as sort of practices that ground you in not only like the art that you're making, but also in your holistic sort of well-being as a person.
100%. I've only in the last kind of year or two, after spending some time reading all these things, realized that they're all connected. So the ink painting that we learned in China, the Tai Chi Chuan practice I mentioned, even TCM, like Chinese medicine, Daoism, they're all rather interlinked with each other, and they're all a holistic approach to wellness and life. So the body is connected to the spirit, to the soul, and is connected to the things that you do and the output that you create. And I think that it's a very useful, I struggle to find the right word because it's not really, I mean, philosophy is maybe a way of describing it, because I know a lot of people see Taoism as a religion, but I feel like it doesn't really have the same, it's not in the same way as like, let's say Christianity or Islam. There's a very prescriptive like sort of mode of behavior. With Taoism, it's very fluid, and it's very, basically it's about like going with the flow. And this flow state, I think, is something that a lot, like when people sort of understand it, they either really get it or not. And I think that's fine. Like not everyone has to be comfortable with this sort of way of being. But for those who it does resonate with, it's incredibly powerful. And I think that then that kind of impacts everything about life. Like so many people have spoken about the sort of health advantages of the Qigong practice. And all of that is also tied into the painting practice, the calligraphy practice. I mean, that's what our teachers were saying, right? That like doing this is for your health.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also music, right? Like with the way that you play traditional instruments, it's also, again, sort of embodying these philosophies within the way you play the music. So it all circles into each other. And I think that's that fluidity for me is a worldview that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Over the past like couple of months, I've been thinking so much about well-being and just how my art, how music, how, you know, going to live music sets, just different things that have contributed to my overall viewpoint on life and art as a creative act or the art of like creative living. I'm fascinated by this and how that like all of these things like contribute to our overall like joy and happiness and I guess just experience of life. Life is a practice, right? The things that we do, they are a practice. And so thank you for sharing about that. I wanted to ask you about this idea of collective unlearning, because you mentioned this. Where like you sort of like invite others into a space, do an act of like collective unlearning. What does that look like in practice for you? And can you share an example where you facilitated a moment where people can have this deep unlearning or reconnection with one another in a space?
I think this is much more aligned with the work I do on the social practice and on the scale of education, most obviously. And then on a personal level, it again reflects my own process or my own path in life of basically learning how to embrace my identity and finding a deep appreciation for the culture that I'm from. And I think having spent a lot of time in the US growing up, I was raised under this very Western centric white worldview and a value system that really only valued Western ideas. The collective unlearning that I'm interested in is really just promoting the idea that there are so many different possibilities in the world and there are so many other centers of value in the world, particularly for people who are of diasporic origin or have, migratory backgrounds or whose families have had to leave their homes for whatever reason, war, dislocation, searching for better opportunities, that there's value in these other cultures too. And there's knowledge held in these cultures and these practices from traditional historic times that come in and out. I think knowledge has this way of disappearing and then reemerging. And I think if we can collectively unlearn how to place that value and how to really sort of question the things that are told to us by the place where we are in, then we can sort of go about processing what's happening in the world from a more nuanced perspective. And an example of this is even just as simple as language. For example, for a long time, I didn't really know how to say like yin yang. Like I was always like, oh, yin yang, like this is the sort of accent, the kitschy culture of the US that I was explaining. And yin and yang as a concept in Daoism and also the painting philosophies, etc., and the Yijing is very powerful. And it's like shadow and light. It's about these counterbalances. Yang is kind of like the sun, yin is the moon. There's these sort of outward energies and inward energies. So the words themselves embody a lot of knowledge. So just even learning how to properly understand that was an unlearning process, and then relearning its real value and its real was very useful for me. And then I've done workshops, like I've also hosted certain events where it's based around sort of revealing this information. Or there was also like a tofu workshop that I hosted where we were doing like a puppet theater show about how tofu made its way to the West. And that was a very interesting and fun kind of activity, but it was grounded in these sort of traditional practices of tofu making. And people kind of relearned how to understand this like product that's now I think it's very present in a lot of spaces. But tofu wasn't always everywhere as it is now.
Absolutely. Speaking about unlearning, I'm wondering if there is something that you feel like we need to learn or unlearn as a collective at this moment in time, whether you're an artist or just a regular person just in the world, or like within our communities. Like, what do you feel like as a collective people on this earth, like what do you feel like we need to unlearn?
I think we've gained a lot of bad habits as a society as far as the way we process information, the way that we learn. We consume information and we consume news in a very passive way. And I think that we don't necessarily go about this deeper thinking, this critical thinking level. And I think we should also really, nowadays it feels like people are kind of in the habit of speaking out more than they were in the past. Yeah. And that's good. But I also wonder if this speaking out is coming from a place of really having thought about what's being said. And also in the, with AI, it becomes very easy to just passively give commands and not really think and then just look at what this AI spits out and just use that as the answer. But we also know that a lot of times this is not perfect. It's also not nuanced enough, or it's not answering the right questions. Yeah. Of course, we can train ourselves to ask better questions, but this critical thinking level and this observation and really listening to what's being discussed is crucial and missing. Again, with social media, the way that information is distributed, people don't have the attention span to really dig deeper. And I think that's going to become more and more important that we learn how to do this. And I think art is useful because it trains exactly that. Like it trains observation and it trains nuanced way of exploring a topic and experimentation that is, as a life skill, very useful.
100%. I couldn't have said that any better. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think to be engaged with arts is sort of a critical act. I think it's a radical act. I think that's why I also think that artists have a unique responsibility in the world to share truth, whatever your own personal truth is. I think we have to reflect the times. I have to ask you about that, and based on where we are in the world right now, because you're an artist who works with tradition, with ritual, and then I would also say presence, especially like when you're doing performance. That is a very present way of working within art. And so I'm curious what your relationship is with AI or with tech in general, and where do you sort of foresee that positioning in your practice and in your life?
I actually don't hate AI. I think I'm very fascinated by it, and I kind of embrace it. I mean, I use it to make my life easier. I use it to do writing. Of course, I often have to unwrite the things that are written. And as with any technology, I think it's meant to help us, right? Unfortunately, the way that people are using AI nowadays, it's in the long term going to negatively impact us unless governments and higher organizational systems are able to come up with a better way of dealing with this gap that will emerge between the labor that is being replaced, basically. But that aside, where it comes in with my personal practice, I guess I don't really use AI directly in my art making necessarily, but I find it very fascinating. Like, I've actually used AI before for counseling, and I was having like a relationship issue, and I asked it some questions, and it gave me some very good ideas. Yeah, I mean, you have to ask the right questions again, like, and you have to really, again, read the answer and then take what you think makes sense for you. And of course, be a bit more vigilant about like what it's giving, like reading what it's giving to you and deciding whether it makes sense or not. But as a possibility, I think as a tool, I think it's very interesting for people, and it should help artists in particular, because I think artists are people who can be a bit bogged down by these administrative tasks or the part of art making that isn't in the studio but more on their laptop. This can be a tool that helps a lot of people with their organization as well. My own art making practice is very analog, so I don't really find myself on the AI bots asking for anything yet, but maybe it's a place to generate ideas. I like the way that it gives you all these possibilities.
Yeah, definitely. And I like what you said when thinking about it in terms of it just being a tool. I think at many moments, like throughout history, there were probably moments where people were opposed to something as simple as like even the internet, right? I guess over time, we then adapt and we're able to sort of accept more things and then come to the understanding that it is just a tool and it can make our lives a lot better in many different ways. Just thinking about like where you are right now and thinking about the future and the future of your work and your practice. I'm wondering if there are any collaborations you're thinking of or things that you would like to do in the future, or like, where do you see your practice going?
I'm very interested in getting to the very root of these materials that I'm working with. So learning how to make paper is something I'm almost like obsessed with. I really want to.
I love that.
I want to go to Anhui, and I will go to Anhui to see these sort of traditional practices. And the process of making paper is so fascinating to me. That's one example. Just deepening my knowledge of the materials that I use and the root of where they come from and how these materials emerged is one part that I'm very interested in. The other part is, of course, continuing my studies with Daoism and the I Ching text. You could, again, spend a whole lifetime understanding this. For me, education is always a big part. So as a teacher and a professor, I think I want to always kind of integrate new ideas into what I'm teaching and really listen to my students and hear what their concerns are and find a way to address their concerns with my experience. Because on the one hand, it's important to adapt to the times, but as I was speaking earlier, there's a lot of wealth of knowledge and traditions and existing practices that can be combined well with new ways of doing things. And then as far as collaborations go, I don't actually have any particular institution or space that I dream of working with. I think it will just come down to whatever feels most relevant to the things I'm making in the studio at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about your practice and sort of how it's rooted in doing research and reading. And so I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that you're reading or anything you'd like to recommend, any book?
Yes, Ken Liu, Liu, has written a great version of the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching is a text, again, from BC era, and now he's written a version that feels accessible to the modern reader, and I've been just reading this a lot. The I Ching text I love. there's a Richard Villen translation. That's mostly it at the moment because they're both quite dense, I will say. Yeah, both of these texts are pretty heavy on the knowledge. So. And then there's a few other just things for fun that I read, but I would say if someone is interested to learn about either of these philosophies, those are good starting points.
Okay, amazing. And I can link all of that info in the episode notes as well. And so, wrapping up our conversation, this has been so fruitful and just insightful. Everything that you're studying and the ways in which you're implementing your own identity and culture and heritage, looking at the archives, also making your works like an extension of tradition, I think is so fascinating. And I also really love what you're doing in terms of tapping back into your culture. I feel like that's such an important thing to do. And I think that we grow so much as individuals when we are able to sort of explore our identity and heritage. And so for you, I know you mentioned that you haven't always been really connected with your culture or maybe resented it a bit. And so I'm just really happy that you sort of come around full circle and finding nuance and beauty in your identity, because only you can say what your unique perspective is. And so I'm encouraged and inspired by that. And just want to sort of wrap up our conversation. Thank you so much. I want to ask you, last question, how do you want people to feel when they encounter your work? Like what's the legacy in relation to your work?
I mean, the first word that springs to my mind is calm. I mean, it's I guess the point of meditation is to reach this calm state. I think there is certainly a hope to access this flow state that I was describing earlier, maybe a more internal space that doesn't have any way there's no word to describe it. It's an emotion that we use art or music or, the creative practices to try to describe these things. But the feeling is something that is indescribable. But definitely it's a feeling that endures across time. So it's something that it also endures across regardless of race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation. Like it's something that as a person, you feel certain things. And those are the emotions that I'm interested in describing or accessing. I would like to dive more into the variety of those emotions. So not just on like good feelings or calm feelings, maybe even reflect more of like this sort of anger and there's certain sadness that exists in the world. And those things are real and present. They don't necessarily have to have a negative connotation. They just exist.
Yeah.
I would edit my answer to say it's more about presence. As you said earlier, it's more about this like creating a very real representation of what we experience in life.
In that moment, yes. Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Lili. This was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Where can listeners find you online?
So I'm on Instagram, Lili, Lili.nacht, Nacht. That's also my website, lilinacht.com, without the period in between. And my email is also contact.lilinacht@gmail.com. So people can also reach out to me if they want to subscribe to my newsletter.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's so great to chat with you. I have so many questions for you as well, but we'll have to catch up on another time.
Yeah, definitely. We'll catch up for sure. Thank you, Lili.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Where we explore the art of creative living. I'm your host, Gherdai Hassell. If today's conversation moved you, inspired you, or sparked something within you, share it with someone who might be interested and who might need it too. You can connect with me on social media at Hassell_free or on my website at www.gherdaihassell.com, or you can join my print club. Until next time, keep creating, keep feeling, and remember, art affects everything. See you next time.